This episode is brought to you in part by the Apologetics Guy Show, the podcast that helps you find clear answers to tough questions about Christianity. Learn to explain your faith with courage and compassion. Join Moody Bible Institute professor Dr. Mikel Del Rosario at apologeticsguy.com.
Hello, everyone. July 20th, 2025 is the 100th anniversary of the day that William Jennings Bryan took the stand during the Scopes monkey trial. I released 2 episodes about this event a few years ago, and I thought I'd replay them now, back to back, in honor of the anniversary. I've been thinking a lot about legacy and the way we remember world events. Articles about Scopes tend to ignore that the whole thing was a publicity stunt, and didn't make a big impact until its story was retold years later. First in a book about nostalgia, and then in Inherit the Wind. Why did they skip that? Really, it doesn't have a huge impact on us today. What matters more is the space it occupied in the public conscience in the aftermath. The event didn't make evangelicals look great, even if Bryan's reasons for taking the case came from a progressive desire to protect human dignity. When we Christians stand up and fight something, we first have to consider if our stance is biblical. Then we need to prayerfully consider what our stand will do to our Christian witness. William Jennings Bryan, the champion against the gold standard, 3-time presidential candidate, respected statesman, and celebrated orator, took the stand 100 years ago. And by some accounts, Clarence Darrow made a monkey out of him. By the way, this bonus episode won't cut into the normal release schedule. I'm currently in the middle of a long series exploring why some evangelicals tied themselves to the Republican Party in the 1970s and 80s, and it is fascinating. So if you're just joining me for the Scopes trial episodes, welcome, and when you're done with this episode, let me recommend starting at the beginning of Season 6 with the episode Prologue, What is Biblical? If any of you are near Dayton, Tennessee for the anniversary, please email me audio clips and photos. I wish I could have been a part of the celebration. Okay, thanks for listening to Truce, and here come the stories. In August of 2021, I got into an old elevator.
In the late 1970s, the county did a major overhaul, installed the elevator, air conditioning, a few other improvements.
The voice you're hearing is from Tom Davis. He's the administrator of elections for Ray County, Tennessee, and the go-to guy there for historic structures. We're making our way to the top floor of an old red brick building. Well, this is lovely. Wow.
The courtroom looks very much the way it did in 1925. Major differences are the ceiling being 18 inches lower because...
This is the site of one of the most famous trials in American history, the so-called Scopes monkey trial. It has hardwood floors and big glass windows. Is this still used as a courtroom today?
It was up until March. The county moved into a new justice center. Spectator seats, the bar around the official court area, the lawyer's table are all original.
Wow. So this is it. This is where they would have sat. This is where they did the whole thing.
The defense sat to the left, the prosecution to the right. There were reporters inside the bar. People were everywhere they could possibly be to get in.
For a history nerd, this was a big deal. Because what happened in this large room echoes through so much of what we're experiencing now. Our us and them mentality, the Bible versus science, truth against myth. Some historians have called this the OJ trial of its time. A public spectacle where the whole country followed along via national broadcast.
Yeah, this was the first American trial broadcast live over a national radio network.
Everyone wanted to know the verdict of this trial. The state of Tennessee, with the urging of William Jennings Bryan and a group of fundamentalist Christians, passed a law. You could not teach evolution in the schools. Not as truth and not as a theory. Not at all. How did this little town, on its way to being forgotten by society, suddenly explode onto the front pages of national newspapers? Did this debacle over evolution and religion really change that much? Some point to this trial as the temporary death of Christian fundamentalism. Others say that it had very little impact at all. The story sticks with us because it illustrates so much of who we are as evangelical Christians and so much of what we're afraid to become. Where do the lines of science and faith intersect? And where do they diverge?
With all due respect to those involved, O.J.'s case was a murder case. And there have been how many in the United States in the last 95 years? But there has been one Scopes trial.
You're listening to the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. We press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truce. Tom and I also went downstairs from the courtroom into the basement museum, which back in 2021 had survived a small flood. Thankfully, he was willing to give me a tour while the working men did their thing in the background. Where do you usually start with your tours here?
We start coming in on the left with an explanation of the Butler Act, the law that said public schools can't teach any theory of human development creation that denies the account found in the Bible.
I covered that in the last episode if you want more information. And thankfully, it looks like none of the artifacts were hurt.
Right. Yeah, they did move the drugstore table and chairs out of their proper spot because it was getting wet over there.
Right. Yeah, oh, so that's from the drugstore.
Yeah.
Well, and the table's pretty small. It seems like for such a big plan, you'd want a larger table. It's about the size of a large pizza.
Yeah, very large pizza.
Just a table. Not that big. But it came from the drugstore that 100 years ago hosted a meeting that kicked off the whole brouhaha that put Dayton on the map.
That was owned by the chairman of the school board.
The drugstore sold ice cream and drinks, but also stuff you probably wouldn't expect, like textbooks, including the one that would become central to this battle over evolution. Dayton is a charming, quintessential small town. A square, statues, its own brewery. But in the 1920s, it seemed like Dayton was on the way out.
Actually reducing in size as the old blast furnace had closed. Ray County was a farming community. Strawberries shipped by rail up to the cities in the north.
By the way, the voice you hear is the ever-interesting Edward Larson. He won the Pulitzer Prize for his excellent book on the trial and teaches at Pepperdine University. This piece of Tennessee was different than the rest of the state.
The whole state is Republican now, but back then, Tennessee, being a southern state, was predominantly Democratic and therefore pro-Bryan. Bryan, remember, had been the Democratic nominee for president.
That's William Jennings Bryan, 3-time nominee for president by the Democratic Party. He lost all 3 times. Then became Secretary of State under President Wilson. He'd earned the nickname Mr. Fundamentalist.
But East Tennessee, historically,
where Dayton is located,
that was the Republican end of the state.
Republican back then meant they were pro-abolition, against Jim Crow laws. Bryan was a Democrat. For a long time, the Democrat. Naturally, Dayton didn't vote for him. The trial, though, was years after Bryan stopped running for office. He turned his attention to other causes, like slowing the spread of social Darwinism. To do that, he and a bunch of other Christian leaders like William Bell Riley and Billy Sunday campaigned to outlaw the teaching of evolution in Tennessee.
And again, he was very precise. He didn't care about the evolution of animals or plants. He probably accepted those things to happen. What he cared about was humans. The Bible is very clear that Adam and Eve are specially created by God. So he can go out and convince people that there was a danger in teaching students as true that they had been created through a Darwinian process of evolution. And so the Tennessee law that he ended up championing, and he went to the Tennessee legislature and helped get it passed, simply says that you can't teach the Darwinian theory of human evolution. It doesn't deal with other sorts of evolution. The ACLU published a notice in the state saying that they would be willing to defend any school teacher in the state who wanted to challenge the law.
The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, you may know, is now almost a cuss word for some evangelicals. In 1925, they put out this advertisement looking for someone to challenge the law. What they needed was an educator willing to teach evolution, get caught, and go to trial. Someone to test the validity of the law in a courtroom. Who would be bold enough, brave enough, or so desperate for attention that they would take on a controversial law in the public eye? Perhaps Dayton?
The town was struggling for business at this time because, as I said, the local blast furnace had closed and they were losing population, and they came up with this idea.
An idea for how to boost the notoriety of the town.
Let's have a test case here.
Let's try this law and see if we can't get people to take notice. It'll spark a media circus, looky-loos, folks from all around who want to take part in history and spend their money in local stores and hotels. Imagine the crowds at the soda fountains, the restaurants. This, BTW, is one way that laws get tested in the United States. An organization wants to test a law, they find someone willing to break it, and then they take the case to court so they can argue that the law should not exist.
I object.
Think Rosa Parks, or even Carrie Buck from my eugenics episode. A small group of citizens met in the soda fountain at a table about the size of a large pizza, with the hope of drawing some much-needed attention to Dayton. The only problem is, who were they going to get to do it? The biology teacher, the person you'd expect to teach evolution, was also the principal of the school. They couldn't sacrifice the principal. But okay, what about the young guy, John Scopes?
He was the football coach and he was the middle school science teacher.
Someone found him playing tennis, called him to the drugstore, and laid out their plan. Would he, John Scopes, be willing to get arrested for teaching evolution?
Now, granted, he hadn't, but that was a minor technicality.
He hadn't even taught evolution. One of the most famous crime stories in American history, and there wasn't even a crime committed. But the young man certainly fit the bill. Scopes wasn't particularly religious, and he was well-liked and a composed guy. Not a bad defendant.
They assured him of his job back. They assured he'd never go to jail. They were that they'd pay his fine if there was one.
There wasn't much to lose. Right there in the drugstore, they arrested John Scopes. With all the major players in order, they contacted the ACLU to tell them they had their test case.
And so the trial began literally as a publicity stunt. How American can you get?
Each of the major players had their own reasons for the battle. Some of them religious, some commercial, some moral, and others to limit the role of government in society.
Bryan was always a champion of big government.
We saw that throughout his political career. He was instrumental in switching the Democrats from wanting a small government to wanting a larger one. When Teddy Roosevelt turned his eyes to progressive reforms like national parks and antitrust laws, Bryan upped the ante.
He trusted popular democracy, and he believed and would say that the people ultimately are always right.
Bryan was a majoritarian. Essentially, he believed that the majority should have the right to make society by their own rules. That's why he backed laws to block the teaching of evolution. If we, the majority of parents in the United States, decide we don't want such and such taught in our schools, shouldn't the schools adjust to our will? Guys like Bryan would say that this is just democracy by another name. Citizens exercising the right to shape their society. Majoritarianism sounds like a great idea, so long as you're in the majority. But when the pendulum of society swings in a different direction, the ideas you fought so hard to establish now can be used against you. Maybe you think that teachers should always follow the will of the people. But then, what if one lone teacher wants to pray in their classroom and the majority says they can't? Majoritarianism requires that you trust your people will always be in charge.
because he thought as long as it's controlled by popular votes, government makes us better. So he was a champion of big government, where the founders of the ACLU and Clarence Darrow were very suspicious of government because they thought that there could be a tyranny of the majority just as much as there could be a tyranny by a king or a Kaiser or an emperor.
The ACLU was founded in part to protect the minority from the will of the majority. Their initial goal was to protect Quakers and pacifists from being conscripted into fighting during World War I. Bryan actually would have agreed with a lot of the ACLU's stances, protecting workers and defending labor, for example. But here they were pitted against each other, with his desire for big government and their hopes to keep that government in check.
The ACLU had been battling these laws throughout the country because they thought that teachers should have an academic freedom to teach and students should have an academic freedom to learn whatever ideas are out there.
Bryan's case may sound pretty narrow-minded, but he was concerned about the spread of social Darwinism. As a post-millennialist, he believed that good governance could make the world a better place and usher in the millennium. He saw social Darwinism as a threat because it gave license to men like John D. Rockefeller to believe that they had the right to treat poor people without respect because rich guys are superior beings. William Jennings Bryan seemed like a natural choice to join the prosecution. Not only was he involved in the law in question, but he was one of the most famous men in the country. Not bad for a publicity stunt. Darrow, on the other hand, was not an easy choice for the defense.
The ACLU had not asked Darrow to be involved in the case. In fact, they had already organized another team of lawyers.
Darrow was maybe the most famous civil libertarian in the country at the time. Why not get him involved?
He was also sort of like a Richard Dawkins of his day. He was a critic of revealed religion in general and literalistic Christianity in particular. And he would go around writing books and debating for agnosticism or even atheism. Darrow had in mind of using the trial not only to promote academic freedom, but really to debunk Christianity, which of course the ACLU didn't want to get anywhere near that third rail.
They wanted to make the case for the right of teachers. Bringing Darrow on would change the narrative.
He knew the ACLU would never want him there. He went straight to John Scopes.
Scopes liked Darrow. So what could the ACLU do? Their defendant wanted to bring the big guns. Of course Scopes did. Getting Darrow involved would mean even more publicity to challenge the law he disagreed with and bring tourism to Dayton.
Basically, they pull their people from the trial, and the leaders of the ACLU don't even go down and attend. And they basically turn it over to Clarence Darrow to run because they're sort of forced out.
The plan was to find the best experts possible to prove the existence of evolution, and to make sure the whole country was paying attention. To do that, they had to get Scopes out in the public.
Scopes never went to jail. Indeed, after the trial was launched and it became front page news, he went on a publicity tour around America. He went to Chicago, he went to New York, he spoke at the American Museum of Natural History, he went to Washington, D.C. He went on a publicity tour around the country. And the ACLU put together an advisory board that included the presidents of Harvard, University of Michigan, University of Stanford University, University of California, Berkeley. And they pulled together this star-studded list of expert witnesses, all Christian, mind you, from the top universities around America like Princeton and Chicago and Vanderbilt to come down and testify. This was not some sort of scene where you had this poor school teacher looking for a lawyer, as it appears in Inherit the Wind.
The Broadway play turned movie that presented a fictionalized version of the trial.
Rather, the lawyers found him.
The town was about to get more than it bargained for. Remember, they were hoping for some publicity and to frame this as a test case,
where the two sides would come together and debate the merits of this law without Scopes's neck being on the line. What happened was that America loves a story. And the best story is that there's this benighted hill town in the benighted South, enraged by fundamentalism, that arrests one of their own teachers. That's just too good a story to pass up because America likes conflict.
Which is funny because so much of the story told to the public and in the later play Inherit the Wind was just not true. Dayton was not a backwater. It had one of the largest courtrooms in the state and a train line. It was Republican, which in those days meant it was liberal. The town wasn't inflamed by fundamentalism. Quite the opposite. The trial was engineered by liberals who wanted to test the law. Scopes wasn't arrested in the school or tossed in jail. He went on a publicity tour, but those nuances were too subtle for the media to grasp. What they wanted was not Dayton, but maybe the town from Dirty Dancing. And it was in the popular imagination that fundamentalism was a Southern ideology, even though it started and found its supporters in the North. Modernism hadn't taken hold in the South, so there was no reason for fundamentalism to blossom. Fundamentalism was largely a Northern phenomenon. With the world on alert, Dayton would soon blossom into a circus, and the trial of the century was about to begin. We'll continue our story after this message. Let's go back to the courthouse in Ray County, Tennessee.
We have a few artifacts, like the typewriter that the court reporter used to type the transcript. Then we have some sheet music. Most people don't associate music with trials, but there were about 15 or 20 songs written about the Scopes trial. Everything from the very serious, the Ballad of William Jennings Bryan talks about his coming to town to defend the anti-evolution statute, to Darwin's Monkey Trot.
People wrote musical tributes to these men and this moment. The small group of men meeting in that drugstore could not have anticipated what their planned test trial would become, a part of national lore and history books, but also a sort of a circus. On the tour, Tom pointed to a black and white picture. Yeah, there's a photo of a monkey up here on the wall.
H.L. Mencken, probably the most famous journalist of the day, called this the monkey trial. So somebody decided if this is going to be the monkey trial, we got to have a monkey. Somebody brought Joe Mindy, who was a movie star chimpanzee, and he's dressed in a three-piece suit and carrying a golf club, ready to go hit the links, I guess. But he performed for children in the town. He was our main monkey.
We're talking about the middle of the 1920s, which were a celebrity era. And we're talking about the jazz age.
Think The Great Gatsby, Prohibition, speakeasies, the ubiquity of the automobile, airline travel, electronic media like radio. So much of this was really new, and the economy was booming.
They thought that thousands of people would descend on the town to watch the trial.
Even toying with the idea of holding court in the baseball stadium so more people could watch. They expected thousands of people to come to Dayton for this. Locals rented out their homes, and the press arrived on the train. The courtroom fit a lot of people, but there wasn't enough space for everyone. So they ran speakers outside so that people could listen on the courthouse lawn. H.L. Mencken, the famous journalist, had suspected the town to be backwards, but found it, at least initially, warm and friendly. The carnival atmosphere also teased out negative stereotypes of the North and the South.
This was a day when you did have lynching in the South, when you did have segregation in the South. Northerners were not moving to the South. It was before air conditioning, it was before the development of the interstate highway system or any of that.
People were leaving the countryside to go to the cities. So there was an element of seeing rural areas as backwaters. Let's go to Dayton and watch the Hicks fight against science. That kind of thing.
Even though the reality doesn't match the legend, you could easily play on the rural, urban, and emphasizing that the anti-evolution movement was squarely rooted in the cities. This wasn't truly a north-south urban-rural, but if you cast it that way, from a propaganda point of view, making it north-south, rural-urban worked. And people like H.L. Mencken played that card.
Bryan arrived at the train station to fanfare, cheers, and waving handkerchiefs 3 days before the main event. His plan was to make speeches and address the people. He'd fallen out of favor after resigning from Wilson's cabinet and failing to denounce the KKK in front of the Democratic National Convention. Though he was still making good money doing his public speaking and regularly drew large crowds at his Florida Bible study, he wasn't what he'd once been. This may have felt like a step back into the national spotlight. The New York defense lawyers, when they pulled into the station, were greeted by almost nobody. One of the men noticed a young fella taking their bags.
What are you doing with those suitcases?
Thinking his luggage was being stolen. One of the locals had to tell him,
"That's all right, Doc. That's only Scopes."
The New Yorkers didn't recognize their own defendant even as he helped them with their bags. When Darrow arrived, he too was met by only a small group. Nothing like the crowds drawn to Bryan. The defendants had an uphill battle to wage. The night before the trial began, Judge Ralston attended a prayer meeting where he said,
I am much interested that the unerring hand of him who is the author of all truth and justice should direct every official act of mine.
Ralston himself was a man of prayer and invited it into his courtroom, even in a trial about the veracity of the Bible. Darrow hoped to strike a blow against Christianity.
When the first prayer was given in court, the prayer was really aimed against his client.
Darrow had spent years of his career fighting so-called blue laws, religiously inspired laws that kept people from doing things like buying alcohol on Sunday. Prayer in court really got under his skin.
Your Honor, I want to make an objection before the jury comes in.
What is it, Mr. Darrow?
I object to prayer, and I object to the jury being present when the court rules on the objection.
Because he saw the trial as one between science and religion. Prayer at the start of the day might constitute bias on the part of the court.
In the end, what they did is they compromised and had sort of neutral prayers given.
He lodged another objection. I got to see what Darrow was complaining about while at the Ray County Museum. Well, I see there's a photo of a man standing in front of a sign that says, "Read your Bible." It's very similar to the one that's outside.
Right. Yeah, okay, that man is John Scopes. The Read Your Bible sign, or a Read Your Bible sign, caused a little bit of controversy during the trial. Darrow took offense at a sign that had been posted on the courthouse wall to encourage people to read your Bible. They argued about that for a while. Bryan finally stood up and said, Your Honor, I think the sign ought to come down. We don't want to offend our brothers during the trial.
And there still is today, I guess.
Well, yeah, we haven't taken it down from our festival, our reenactment yet. Maintenance has been busy.
As you can imagine, because of the flooding, some of the prosecutors were upset at Darrow's request to take the banner down. Bryan calmed them.
If leaving that up there during the trial makes our brother to offend, I would take it down during the trial.
First, the squabble over prayer, then the banner. But the central battle in the trial was the question of whether or not to allow expert testimony to be heard by the jury.
Both sides had said they were going to bring in expert witnesses to debate the merits of the statute.
That was one reason Darrow paraded Scopes around the Northeast, to find experts who would testify to the legitimacy of teaching evolution in the classroom.
Bryan instead, and the prosecution, moved to exclude all expert witness, saying it's irrelevant because the only thing relevant is whether Scopes taught evolution. The ACLU was not going to object to that because they wanted this law judged. If Scopes was convicted, they could then appeal to the state Supreme Court and then ultimately to the United States Supreme Court to try to get the law struck down as unconstitutional. That was their goal. They didn't let Scopes take the stand because he would have had to admit that he hadn't taught evolution. And he actually coached his students to say that he had taught evolution.
In other words, the ACLU wanted Scopes to lose. That's the only way that the case could climb its way to the higher courts, where the law could be removed. Yet Dayon and the defense fought to keep the expert witnesses in the trial. Day after day, this was the big concern. All the while, the jury sat out of the proceedings as the lawyers haggled over what they could and could not hear. There were no empty seats. And I can tell you from personal experience, it gets really hot and muggy in Dayton.
The trial went on for over a week, but what they did is they debated whether you could admit witnesses. They debated whether the law was constitutional. So the jury was excused for all of those portions, and what really frustrated him, they were prohibited from going in the various other venues and listening to it over the loudspeaker because they weren't supposed to hear that.
While Scopes hadn't taught evolution, the students in the school used a book called Civic Biology that clearly did. A textbook that was sold in the very drugstore where the trial began, and one that was approved by the state of Tennessee's textbook board. It's the one that students were asked if they used in class. The book didn't stop at evolution, but tied evolution to eugenics. I got a chance to see a copy of it myself when I visited Bryan College in Dayton. Well, this looks like it actually belonged to a student because all their periods are listed in the back of the book. It says first period was biology, second period physical education, where I met Kevin Woodruff.
I am the research literacy librarian at Bryan College in Dayton, Tennessee.
He and I spent almost 2 hours talking about the trial and looking through the archives at the Bryan College Library. The machine that manages the temperature in the archives was particularly loud that day. It's a green book with sort of worn, yellowed, but glossy pages.
Yeah.
Mr. Woodruff read some of it for me.
When people marry, there are certain things that the individual as well as the race should demand. Okay, sounds very...
Eugenics-y?
Yeah. Epilepsy and feeble-mindedness are handicaps which is not unfair but criminal to hand down to posterity. So
Yeah, that's horrible.
Well, it's hard to believe, but that's what was being taught.
Right, that's the textbook. That's from the section on eugenics, clearly stating it is immoral for epileptics and those with mental issues to reproduce. William Jennings Bryan's dystopian scenario printed in schoolbook form. Rather than explore the literal advocacy of eugenics, it was never mentioned. Instead, this epic showdown of the ages, one that Bryan described in advance as a battle royal, kind of became a royal dud as far as the media was concerned.
If you narrow the case down to, did Scopes teach evolution, then there's really not much of a case. That's why the actual trial, that is, when the jury's involved, took only 2 hours. There wasn't much to debate.
They removed all of the sensational stuff. Without the experts giving testimony, this was just a simple case establishing if a small-town teacher taught evolution, not something that sells newspapers. Instead, the defense admitted that their client broke the law.
Darrow literally tells the jury, says, you have no choice. You're going to have to convict my defendant.
What kind of battle is that? The defense attorney told the jury to convict. Telegraphs had transmitted 20,000 words a day. Special lines were strung. People were listening all over the country. Friday, the evening before closing arguments were scheduled, reporters started leaving, thinking there was nothing to see, no battle royal. In fact, some of the prosecutors even went swimming with Scopes during a recess midweek. Where was the throwdown? Only the closing arguments remained. Darrow knew that William Jennings Bryan had prepared a doozy. Bryan was one of the best orators of his time. Darrow did not want Bryan to give his grand address, to influence the minds of the country. What he did was hatch a plan, to use the legal system to keep Bryan from giving his prepared closing statement. But simply preventing his opponent from speaking wasn't enough. He wanted to crush religion. The best way to do that wasn't by silencing Bryan, but by calling him to the stand. The resulting testimony would eclipse all the rest of Bryan's legacy in the eyes of many. It became the thing he's most known for today. That moment when the accused was ignored and the prosecutor was on trial. What happened next came to define the career of William Jennings Bryan and completely shaped the way we see fundamentalism today. We'll continue our story in the next episode.
It was a savage encounter, and a tragic one for the ex-Secretary of State. He was defending what he held most dear.
This is an excerpt from a best-selling book of the 1930s. When the nation was mired in the Great Depression, people looked for hope wherever they could. Movies, radio, and in this case, nostalgia. Only Yesterday, that's the name of the book, written by Lewis Allen, was a smash hit, transporting people just one decade earlier from the breadlines to the roaring 20s. It's a quick entry, just a few paragraphs. But this retelling of the Scopes monkey trial shaped how people would see it for decades.
Dayon declared that his purpose in examining Bryan was, quote, to show up fundamentalism, to prevent bigots and ignoramuses from controlling the educational system of the United States, end quote. And Bryan jumped up, his face purple, and shook his fist at Dayon, crying, quote, to protect the word of God against the greatest atheist and agnostic in the United States.
I've been telling this long story this season, how Christian fundamentalism rose in the United States, from reinvigoration of prophecy after the French Revolution to the creation of dispensationalism, a new interest in premillennialism. New theologies that challenged the veracity of the Bible encouraged some Christians to stray from literal readings of the Bible, while others built theologies designed to reinforce belief in the Scriptures. The Spanish-American War pushed some evangelicals to embrace war as an evangelism tool, while the brutality of World War I affirmed the belief of many that the world was about to end. Through a big chunk of that time, William Jennings Bryan was in the public eye. First as a member of the House of Representatives, then a celebrity on the lecture circuit, 3-time presidential nominee for the Democratic Party, later Secretary of State. Now, he'd earned the title of Mr. Fundamentalist. No small undertaking for a man who was a fundamentalist more in title than in belief. Bryan was an accomplished star, known the world over. A man of God who preached a mishmash of social gospel and fundamentalism and helped to shift politics in the United States. But 50 years later, he'd be known as a rube, backwards. The man who single-handedly killed a movement, even though he didn't. But the lie started there, with Only Yesterday.
Theoretically, fundamentalism had won, for the law stood. Yet really, fundamentalism had lost. Legislators might go on passing anti-evolution laws, and in the hinterlands, the pious might still keep their religion locked in a science-proof compartment of their minds. But civilized opinion everywhere had regarded the Dayton trial with amazement and amusement, and the slow drift away from fundamentalist certainty continued.
Did Bryan steer fundamentalism on a course to obscurity? Did his testimony on a hot day in Dayton, Tennessee, stop the spread of Christian fundamentalism? Did he make a monkey of his people, his party, and his God? You're listening to the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. We press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. I'm Chris Starron, and this is Truce. When we left off in our last episode, the trial of the century turned out to be a dud. Hundreds of members of the press descended on Dayton, Tennessee to witness a battle royal between two of the most famous men in the United States. William Jennings Bryan and his one-time political supporter turned foe, the infamous lawyer of unpopular causes, Clarence Darrow. A week of procedure and scuffles yielded no gold. Yes, there was a verbal gem here and a quick back and forth there, but no last man standing battle. Without much to report on, some of the press went home, thinking this thing was pretty much over. But the linchpin moment was yet to come. A trap expertly set by one lawyer and stumbled into by another. Only yesterday, written much later, would get this event completely wrong and shape the way we've been describing fundamentalism for decades. When William Jennings Bryan, the lawyer for the prosecution, was called to the stand to represent fundamentalism itself. It began with the closing arguments. Bryan was expected to shine. This would be his moment.
He had been talking about it for 2 months.
This is Edward Larson, author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book Summer for the Gods, about this very trial. He now teaches at Pepperdine University.
William Jennings Bryan was not much of a debater. He was more of a stump orator. And if he had a speech, it sang. He was a beautiful public orator.
Decades earlier, his Cross of Gold speech not only won him the nomination of the Democratic Party for president, but went down as the greatest speech in convention history. The man could deliver, and almost everyone was looking forward to his closing arguments in the Scopes trial.
And so he had prepared and carefully crafted a closing argument, which was one of his great speeches.
Bryan was a majoritarian, a believer that the majority opinion among parents should decide what their children learn in school. He also wanted to point out how he thought Darwin's beliefs led directly to terrible outcomes. Bryan had read the works of Friedrich Nietzsche, which say that the highest goal of humanity is to evolve, not to love our neighbors, and that the only way to do that is to reject Christianity. It's a sort of evolution-first idea that justifies stepping on other people if it means furthering the species. Bryan and other people like him didn't want that taught to their children because it could lead to more cruelty like they'd just experienced in World War I. That was Bryan's planned speech in a nutshell.
And so they thought that was going to be given on Monday, along with Clarence Darrow, who was famous for giving mesmerizing closing arguments.
Darrow, the infamous atheist lawyer, was forever in the newspaper for his participation in sensational trials of the day, defending Eugene Debs, Leopold and Loeb, and now evolution in the classroom. Both men were at the top of their game. The closing arguments were supposed to be exactly what the public wanted, a duel between the two juggernauts. But Darrow had a trick up his sleeve.
He knew that under Tennessee jurisprudence, if the defense waives its closing argument,
if Darrow were to give up his closing argument,
then under Tennessee law, the prosecution cannot give a closing argument.
Bryan can't give his either. Thus, Darrow could avoid giving Bryan an open stage, essentially silence his opponent. Bryan had barely spoken all week. He mostly left that up to the local prosecutor. This final speech was going to be his big chance, and it was stolen from him. Darrow, on the other hand, sprinkled his opinions throughout the past week. The nation heard lots from him, and relatively little from Bryan. This was a master stroke. Darrow wanted to keep him on his toes.
So when that last day comes, Darrow, who always has a plan, a very clever lawyer, he's going to waive his closing argument, and therefore he's going to leave Bryan unable to speak.
Darrow wants to pick a fight.
And therefore he had come up with the idea that at the last minute, I will call Bryan to the stand as an expert witness. Now, Bryan qualifies in a way as an expert witness because he had a weekly column in newspapers about the Bible that was published throughout the country, and he published books on biblical interpretation, and he spoke widely about the Bible. He also knew that Bryan was a very proud man, and so he had spent the whole week in the courtroom and speaking to reporters after the trial, just belittling Bryan. He's too scared to talk. He's not participating in this trial. He's just sitting there and letting the prosecution do everything. He's afraid to defend his cause before the public. So he kept needling him in this way. And his hope was that at the last minute, he says, look, you won't take my other witnesses. I have one more witness I want to call.
The defense desires to call Mr. Bryan.
as a witness. To keep Brian from sensing his intention, Darrow had one of the other lawyers call him to the stand. Brian was no dummy. He decided that if he could be called, so could Darrow.
If your honor please, I insist that Mr. Darrow can be put on the stand, and Mr. Malone, and Mr. Hayes.
Call anybody you desire. Ask them any question you wish.
Then we will call all three of them.
Brian now had the right to call Darrow and the other lawyers to the stand as well. Forget hearing the case. Forget the fact that the prosecution had already basically won. Darrow and Brian wanted their showdown. Yet, Brian had different expectations than Darrow did.
He thought he'd be asked questions about the theory of evolution and about laws restricting the teaching evolution and majoritarian democracy, all things like this, things that were relevant to the case.
Maybe he could borrow from his prepared comments a bit, not have to wing it completely. But the chief prosecutor objected. Objection! Because really, what business does Brian have being called as a witness? He wasn't there to see Scopes teach evolution. He wasn't anywhere nearby when the crime was supposedly committed. Didn't know Scopes before the trial. Didn't have anything really to contribute to the case. He was a prosecutor, not the defendant.
The judge says, you don't have to come up to the stand, Mr. Brian. But Brian says, I want to.
The prosecutor objected over 20 times, but against the advice of his team, Brian went anyway.
He moves it onto that bandstand that they've built on the side of the yard so that the whole town can come and hear it.
The judge actually moved the venue outside, saying that the floor in the building was too weak to hold so many spectators. Why not go to the bandstand? I spoke with Tom Davis, who's on the election commission in Dayton, Tennessee, and works to preserve the history of the trial, what he thought about all this. There was a question as to whether or not the floor would hold up under the weight of all the people in there. Has there been actual structural damage to it based on that?
I'm not really one to argue with the judge.
Okay.
But in the late 1970s, the county did an extensive renovation restoration. And I understand at that point they drilled through 18 inches of concrete here and there to get stuff installed. My theory is the judge was hot, the room was crowded, so he moved outside. Let's just put it that way.
So it probably wasn't going to collapse. Still, they moved the trial outside. Today, there's still a bandstand on the side of the building where concerts are performed and the trial is reenacted each summer. The courthouse is located in the middle of the town square, surrounded by shops and the Board of Elections.
2,000 people. They pour out from all the venues. They pour out from the towns. The women, children come out. The people hawking beverages, selling beverages and selling food come out and start going among the crowd like it's a football game. And they're all outside for this what they thought were closing arguments. And instead, Brian takes the stand.
Darrow practiced this moment with members of his staff. They rehearsed the whole thing. Brian came in cold.
One thing any lawyer will tell you is you never ask a question of a witness unless any answer he gives can't help your cause. So he's not going to ask whether evolution's right, or he's not going to ask whether anti-evolution laws are good.
Because that plays right into Brian's strong suit, the kind of stuff he would have talked about if he'd had closing arguments.
He instead asked the various typical age-old village atheist questions.
Asking about things like the story of Jonah.
But do you believe that he made them, that he made such a fish, and that it was big enough to swallow Jonah?
Yes, sir. Let me add, one miracle is just as easy to believe as another.
And Prosecutor Stewart, Brian's teammate in this joust, objected throughout.
I object to that as argumentative.
But the questioning kept going. Darrow digging into just how literally Brian took the Bible.
Do you believe Joshua made the sun stand still?
I believe what the Bible says. I suppose you mean that the earth stood still?
I don't know. I am talking about the Bible now.
I accept the Bible. Absolutely.
Do you believe at that time the entire sun went around the earth?
No, I believe that the earth goes around the sun.
And a lot of other questions along those lines.
Now, Mr. Bryan, have you ever pondered what would have happened to the earth if it had stood still?
Do you believe the world was created in 6 literal days? Where did Cain get his wife?
And then it came to downright name-calling.
These gentlemen have not had much chance. They did not come here to try this case. They came here to try revealed religion. I am here to defend it, and they can ask me any question they please.
This may seem like bluster, but remember that Clarence Darrow did go there to try religion. That was the whole reason the ACLU hesitated to ask him to join, why he went around them to John Scopes himself, because Darrow wanted to make a spectacle of Christianity.
Great applause from the bleachers.
From those whom you call yokels.
I have never called them yokels.
That is the ignorance of Tennessee, the bigotry.
You mean who are applauding you?
Those are the people whom you insult.
You insult every man of science and learning in the world because he does not believe in your fool religion.
These questions had been asked for generations. Darrow knew that there were no good answers to them. Either you're going to sound sort of strange, or you're going to deny it. You're going to say, well, I don't believe in the earth was created in 6 days within the last 10,000 years. And of course, he knew Bryan didn't believe that. He knew Bryan believed that the earth was very old, eons old, and the days of creation symbolized ages of geological history, because Bryan had written all those things. And then he's going to sound like, well, if you can interpret some things in the Bible, then why can't we interpret other things? Why can't we say that evolution is the means of God's creation? I mean, he had Bryan any way he went.
And Bryan,
you believe that all the living things that were not contained in the ark were destroyed.
I think the fish may have lived.
kind of stumbled through, while Darrow kept berating him.
Are you the only human being on earth who knows what the Bible means?
Bryan was in a tough place. As Edward Larson said, he didn't actually believe in a young earth. He thought it was old. But admitting that might feel like a betrayal of the fundamentalist community that followed him. He was Mr. Fundamentalist after all, and some fundamentalists, not all, believe in a literal 6-day creation of the earth. Either he was going to lie about his own beliefs, or he was going to upset his base.
He's torn because there is the local town out there within his hearing, within his sight, and accepted a very literal reading of the Bible. But he also knew this was being broadcast nationwide on the radio and being reported in every newspaper in the country, from the Los Angeles Times to the New York Times to the, you name it. He cared about people's faith. He cared that people believed in Christ. And he cared about Christianity, and he cared about morality. And so he was in the difficult position of having to speak to a local audience or a national audience, and to both of them defend Christianity. On the spot, he couldn't do it.
For him, it was agony.
As long as you're talking to one person or one type of audience, you can word things in a way that you never say anything you don't believe, but instead present the gospel in an appealing manner. God is love, Christ is peace, there's salvation, there's hope for eternal life. Those things. That's what Bryan usually focused on. And he avoided the details that would alienate people. In that way, more recently, he'd be like a Billy Graham. He wasn't the type of a preacher who would take a hard edge that would drive some people off in return to bring other people. He tended to be more ecumenical in his approach.
This trial was followed everywhere, not just in big newspapers, but also in lesser publications like farming journals. The stakes were high, and Bryan had to appeal to a wide audience. According to Only Yesterday, the book I talked about at the beginning of this episode, this moment with Bryan on the stand was the defining point of the trial. And because Bryan wavered on the stand wasn't as strong as maybe he could have been, he killed fundamentalism, which is the way this story is sometimes told. The people on the radio and in the audience heard the debate and thought Bryan flip-flopped or was weak on the stand and killed the movement. It's that way when you see the movie or play Inherit the Wind, which is loosely based on this trial. That, however, was not the case in real life.
I tried to look at next day editorials or editorials that were written in the next issue of the newspapers to see, since they were following it, what did they say? I literally read hundreds of them. And there's not a single one that declares a victor. Every one of them said, whoa, this is a mess. This has simply divided people.
They didn't pick a winner. Even the fundamentalist journals of the day didn't. They might acknowledge that Bryan messed up, or that he had not done his very best job.
But they could excuse it. Who wouldn't look like a fool if they were being cross-examined by Clarence Darrow? He's the most effective person for cross-examination in the country. He can make anybody look foolish.
Conservative newspapers, liberal ones, they all saw the Scopes monkey trial as a draw. Scopes was convicted, clearly, and that was that. Despite what Only Yesterday said, Bryan wasn't seen as losing immediately after the trial. More importantly, they knew even then that this was not the end of the modernist fundamentalist debate. Evolution debates were there to stay.
They wouldn't use the term then, but basically they've created a cultural war. They have made this issue, which was not a major issue before, they have made this to the front lines of the battle, and we're going to see a lot more about this.
They knew even then that this wasn't going away, and it hasn't. The trial ultimately wrapped up with Bryan's testimony on the stand being expunged from the record by the judge. But by then, it had already been broadcast to the nation and transcribed in print. Everyone already heard it. And because Bryan's testimony was kind of a fiasco, the judge did not let Darrow and the defense take the stand. Bryan never got his opportunity to cross-examine the defense. After the trial, Bryan still gave speeches and sermons in town. He got his message out, but so had the defense and the ACLU.
2 other states quickly passed laws much like the Tennessee law, one in Mississippi and one in Arkansas. In tribute to Bryan, they built a college in Dayton, Tennessee.
It's now called Bryan College. I got to take a tour of the library there, and patrons of the show can hear my interview with the librarian by visiting patreon.com/trucepodcast. The town didn't hate Bryan, even though they didn't vote for him because they were Republicans and he was a Democrat. Instead, a whole college was built there in his name. People at that time didn't see it as a failure, and it certainly didn't stop fundamentalism from spreading. What the Scopes trial did, primarily, was help to drive fundamentalism out of the mainstream. The battle had been on the radio and in newspapers. It wasn't a failure, but it wasn't the win they'd hoped for. The fundamentalists had lost their fights in the Northern Baptist and Northern Presbyterian denominations. And now this.
While it was already there, I think that the Scopes trial did contribute to a sense of division, that our ideas will no longer be taken seriously, and we fundamentalists will be ridiculed in the way that Bryan was ridiculed by Darrow on the witness stand, because nobody can listen to or read that cross-examination of Bryan without thinking, and even the mainline press, even liberals would say, this was almost unconscionable, the way Darrow treated a person who had been nominated for president 3 times, was clearly older and no longer at the top of the game, a person who had been Secretary of State. This is just not a Christian. This is not an American way to treat this person. And this sense that if you're going to so ridicule William Jennings Bryan, who, remember, was not a conservative. He was a very liberal political leader. if you're going to do this to him, and Bryan and Darrow had actually been friends and allies. Darrow had backed Bryan's campaigns for president, and they'd worked together to oppose entry into World War I. It just seemed to be a type of attack that just didn't seem right. And therefore, there was a sense that among some Christians and among some evangelicals and fundamentalists is to pull out and to form their own subculture.
It helped push fundamentalism underground. The fundamentalists had been doing things by the D.L. Moody Handbook, building their own schools, colleges, radio shows, conferences, publications, and more. Christian fundamentalists didn't really need secular society to love them. Instead, they had their own society. After all of this talk about William Jennings Bryan, all of his studies, I wanted to know what Mr. Larson thought about the commoner.
You're right. It's a difficult question because William Jennings Bryan was a controversial figure. You can look at him in history textbooks, and he moves from being a hero of populism and progressivism in the 1890s to the GOAT, as it were, of the 1920s with the Scopes trial, and not only with the Scopes trial, but also his defense of the Ku Klux Klan at the Democratic Convention in 1924. It is a mixed story. William Jennings Bryan backs some very noble causes, like eventually women's suffrage. He also backs some failed causes like prohibition. He fights child labor. But if you look at him at every one of these steps, there isn't a whole lot of depth there. You admire some of his causes. You don't admire some of the others. He raised good points, accurate points about the dangers of social Darwinism. But William Allen White, the great American journalist, who was fairly conservative himself, publisher of the Emporia Gazette, once said of Bryan, and he was sort of a fan of Bryan, he described Bryan as like a shallow pan, a very wide but not very deep. And the result is, he should not have walked into the trap at the Scopes trial. He shouldn't have walked into that closing argument. He should have known better. And once he got into it, he should have been able to turn it so he wasn't answering the types of questions in the way he was. You can see that in Bryan a whole bunch of times.
He was opposed to the Spanish-American War and then assembled soldiers from Nebraska to go fight in it. He sometimes seemed like an advocate for the social gospel, but didn't cut Jesus out of it the way that others did. He was, above all, a moving target.
How do you put these things together? And you're faced with that with Bryan all the time. He viewed himself as largely responsible for more constitutional amendments than anybody in American history except for James Madison in the Bill of Rights, because he claimed at least significant credit for women's suffrage, for the federal income tax, for a variety of amendments that were passed around in the progressive era. And so, yes, he deserves a lot of credit. He's an American figure, but he's a complex American figure that cannot, you just can't treat him in that way like a Washington or a Lincoln or a FDR. There's too many sides to him to easily pigeonhole him. But I do believe that he was a sincere person who wanted to help people, even if he didn't understand exactly how to do so all the time. I didn't come into this writing this book, since I didn't write it with a cause in mind. I wrote it as a historian, just trying to figure out what happened. And I had a typical American's mixed view of both Bryan and Darrow. I ended up the process of really digging deeply into both men. I came to the end, I admired both men more. I admired Clarence Darrow and I admired William Jennings Bryan more after I finished the book than before I began it. And, when you look at anybody that closely and you end up in that way, that's to their credit.
Bryan didn't lose the Scopes trial in the moment. Yeah, he didn't look so good. But it was the aftermath of what happened years later that really scrambled our vision of the Scopes trial. Only yesterday said it was a defeat. But the massively popular play and subsequent movie versions of Inherit the Wind made it much, much worse, portraying Brian as a buffoon. And not like he tied, but like really blew it. It's an example of art rewriting history. We'll get into that in the next episode. After the trial, Scopes was fined $100, which both Brian and the Baltimore Evening Sun offered to pay. Brian stayed on in Dayton, telling everyone there that he should have been able to cross-examine Darrow and the rest of the defense. He was pulled on stage. Why shouldn't the other guys be there too? On Sunday, July 26th, Brian attended a local church service and offered a prayer. He had lunch with his wife Mary and arranged to publish his undelivered speech. But it was getting hot. He was tired. Now, talk about a long week, a busy life. Brian lay down before the evening sermon, and he never woke up. Later legend would have it that he died of a broken heart, having been humiliated in front of the country. That story is not likely. It was probably due to complications with his diabetes. 3 days after his death, his coffin was loaded onto a train with the car door open, so people could see the casket. 20,000 people viewed it when it arrived at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. His legacy was shaped not just by what he said, but by what people said about him. The journalist H.L. Mencken wrote terrible things about Brian and his supporters.
I had never been on close terms with country people before. I set out laughing and returned shivering.
In Mencken's opinion, democracy was a way for lowly people to fire against their mental superiors. And he saw Brian, the populist, as their ringleader.
He seemed only a poor clod, like those around him, deluded by a childish theology full of an almost pathological hatred of all learning, all human dignity, all beauty, all fine and noble things. He was a peasant come home to the barnyard.
Mencken's writings went on to shape the way that liberal thinkers remembered the moment and characterized the fundamentalists. Even though, come on, Mencken was no angel. He called Brian a bigot, and yet, ironically, Mencken was a lifelong anti-Semite who backed the Germans, even blinding him to Nazism. No matter where I looked in researching this season, it seems like there were few people with excellent track records. We may want to blast fundamentalism, but it seems like atheists, modernists, and society at large in that era should shoulder some of our critique, as well as responsibility for the strife we still feel today. When one side goes extreme, the other feels like it has to be even more extreme. So they push farther and farther from each other, and from common sense. The legacy of this event grew into something else completely, a reason to beat down fundamentalism. Is it any wonder that fundamentalists went underground? If the morals of society were changing, they lost their voice in the denominations, and guys like Mencken castigated them in the media, why wouldn't they go underground? Use this system of schools, radio broadcasts, publications, and conferences to slip out of the mainstream, thus becoming more insular, raise children, and live a whole life in their own bubble. The pressure was there, and the infrastructure needed to manufacture an alternate society was in place, not to let them off the hook. There is a major downside to believing that not only is the world sliding into chaos, but so is the church. It removes the drive to improve the Big C church, or society. It can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If Bible-believing Christians are not in churches, schools, and civic organizations, why are we surprised when those things slip into secular ways? Which came first, the society descending into godlessness, or the retreat of Christians from society? It's a chicken and egg question. Finally, there are lasting lessons in Brian's testimony. Brian should have known better than to allow himself to get baited into the confrontation. His team already won the case. They had nothing to prove. Instead of staying calm, his pride and celebrity drew him into Darrow's trap, and he was embarrassed in front of the nation, and eventually made to look like a rube when the story was retold on Broadway. There is a time to confront, and a time to remain quiet. When his friends ditched him at the trial, he should have taken it as a sign to be cautious. He did not, and it hurt his legacy. For those of us today trying to untangle ourselves from heresies who are hoping to call people back to the Bible to a relationship with Jesus, what have we learned about what not to do? Are we to withdraw from society, feel as though we are always under attack? Or are we to quietly do the right thing, love the Lord and love our neighbors? How will the history books remember us, even 1 decade from now? Either we do the right thing the right way for the right reasons and at the right time, or we make a monkey out of ourselves and our beliefs. Special thanks to Edward Larson. He's the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Summer for the Gods. It is truly excellent and gets into way more detail than I did here. Thanks also to Tom Davis and everyone I spoke to in Ray County, Tennessee. As always, you can find discussion questions for this episode in your show notes and on the website if you want to talk about it further with your friends and family. Thanks also to everyone who gave their voice to this episode. My friend B.T. Stevenson, my brother Nick Starrin, Jerry Dugan of the Beyond the Rut podcast, and Marcus Watson of the Spiritual Life and Leadership podcast. Truce is listener-supported. If you'd like to see this show flourish, maybe even get more frequent episodes and be a part of something really big and new in Christian podcasting, support this project by becoming a patron. Patrons get special bonuses not heard anywhere else. Learn more about how you can further the work of the Truce Podcast by visiting trucepodcast.com/donate. Thanks for listening. I'm Chris Starrin, and this is Truce.